Hello, everyone. We are getting there. We are in week 13 talking about Latin American families. So, the first um, piece we read for this week was our chapter on how systems of privilege work. So, ultimately, we're looking at how a social system actually has to be set up for privilege and oppression to keep reproducing themselves. This chapter argues that there are three core features: dominance, identification, and centering, and that those features make privilege look normal, deserved, and invisible. The author starts with a simple point. We can describe how a system works without describing the personalities of the people inside it. Think of monopoly. Greedy outcomes come from the rules. In the same way, patriarchy or white supremacy don't require bad people, they require rules, norms, and expectations that push most people down the same paths. The author says that systems organized around privilege do three things at once. First, they're dominated by the privileged group. The top jobs are mostly them. Second, they're identified with that group. That group is treated as the social standard. And third, they're centered on that group. They get the attention, the airtime, the stories. Those three together make inequality feel natural. In a male dominated or white dominated system, power routinely sits with men or white individuals. A man in power looks ordinary. A woman in power often has to be marked, like the Iron Lady or for Margaret Thatcher. That marking tells us women's power is an exception that needs explaining. So, domination is about who usually ends up with authority, not about every single man or every single white person being powerful. The chapter gives a familiar gender example. Men are pulled toward talking, explaining, taking up space, and appearing sure. Women are pulled toward listening, deferring, and taking up less space. Those are paths of least resistance, what's easiest to do without pushback, not proof that men are naturally dominant or that women are naturally submissive. The second feature is identification. The society is defined in terms of the privileged group. On many US campuses, for example, students of color feel pressure to talk and dress like middle class white people to be seen as normal. In gender, masculinity is taken as the human standard. Think of using he to mean everyone. Everyone else is defined in relation to that standard as the other. The third feature is centering. Stories, cameras, and attention point mostly to the dominant group: white, heterosexual, non disabled men in the US. When films do focus on people of color, women, disabled people, or queer people, that identity becomes the topic of the film. But movies about white men are just movies about people. That centering makes other groups feel erased or like they have to shout to be seen. Once a system is male identified and male centered, women get squeezed. If they lean into feminine norms, they're read as not leadership material. If they act like the masculine professional ideal, assertive, detached, and in control, they get labeled as cold or unfeminine. That's a classic double bind. And that's a sign the system is organized for everyone else's body and biography. I'm sorry, that's a classic double bind, and it's a sign the system is organized for someone else's body and biography. The author then widens the lens. Racism, sexism, ableism, heterosexism are not only about people who hate, they're also about all the small and large actions and inactions that help keep the pattern in place. So if a workplace never asks why all managers are men, that silence is a part of sexism. If a school never asks why disabled students are excluded, that silence is a part of ableism. One of the strongest points in the chapter is about silence. Most oppressive acts are done by a few people, but they rely on a silent crowd that doesn't object. When bystanders do nothing, perpetrators assume support. We couldn't do this without you. So, doing nothing in a system like this is not neutral. It helps the system keep going. The chapter finishes by saying we don't get to grow up in male centered, white centered, non disabled centered culture and stay completely untouched. We absorb messages the same way we absorb language. That doesn't make us monsters, but it does mean we've inherited something to work on. The useful response isn't guilt, it's taking responsibility. So, why bother with this systems model? Because it stops us from getting stuck on, are you personally a racist or sexist? And helps us see the machinery that keeps producing unequal outcomes. If we can see domination, identification, centering, and silence, we can decide where to break the pattern by speaking up, by recentering, by making others visible. That's the first move toward change. Then our next reading was looking at Bean et al.'s 2001 article on culturally competent marriage and family therapists with Hispanic families. Their goal was very practical. From the existing treatment literature, what concrete things should therapists actually do? So we'll walk through these guidelines that they pulled together and talk about why these moves make sense for many Hispanic families. The authors start from demographics. Hispanic and Latino populations in the US are growing quickly, so family therapists are increasingly going to see these clients. But MFT literature has lagged behind counseling and psychology in offering detailed, culturally specific guidance. So the question is, what can supervisors actually teach and later evaluate rather than just telling students, be culturally sensitive? To build their list, they pulled the 4 most frequently cited resources on Hispanic and Latino family work. Things like McGoldrick et al. And Ho and add them and then read them multiple times. The reviewers open-coded the texts for therapist behaviors, collapsed similar ones, and only kept items that showed up in at least 3 of the 4 sources. That way, we're not looking at a single author's opinion, but at consensus themes. They ended up with 11 guidelines, and they argue 10 of them are solid enough to treat as indicators of multicultural competence. Before we dive into the individual guidelines, it helps to name the cultural patterns that show up across the article. One is familialismo. Familismo. Family is central and identity being relational. Another is that many families often have immigration stories. Another is that many families have immigration histories and uneven acculturation, which creates stressors. A third is respect for hierarchy, often organized around the father or father figure. And finally, a value on warm personal connection, personalismo, which affects how we should enter the system. The first guideline is very MFT friendly. Use family therapy as your preferred modality. That's because bringing the family in fits with familismo and lets you involve extended kin who are actually part of the day-to-day coping. The Miami work by the author with S and colleagues shows structural ecosystemic approaches work well with Hispanic adolescents, better than individual treatments alone, which sometimes helped the youth but made family functioning worse because the underlying patterns weren't addressed. So doing individual work with the adolescents didn't actually help the system. The second guideline says don't confine your work to the therapy room. Hispanic families are often negotiating schools, juvenile justice, immigration-related stress, and churches at the same time. A culturally competent therapist is willing to help the family interface with those systems, sometimes directly, sometimes by mobilizing their natural support. This is consistent with Falikov's and Sapochnik's ecosystemic thinking. Guideline 3, always find out the immigration story. Who was born where, who came first, and what stressors came with that move. Central American families, for example, may have trauma linked to civil conflict. Guideline 4, assess acculturation and not just globally. Look for mismatches. Kids often acculturate and learn English faster than parents. That can flip hierarchies, increase parent-adolescent conflict, and make therapy look like the kid is acting out when underneath it's an acculturation gap problem. Our job is to name both cultures' strengths and help the family negotiate a bicultural stance. Next, language. The article says the clear preference is a bilingual, bicultural therapist. If that's not possible, use an interpreter who's trusted and who won't soften conflict. And do not put the children in the interpreter role. Besides loyalty issues, it disrupts hierarchy. Interestingly, they note a study where a culturally knowledgeable therapist still had good outcomes in English with more acculturated clients. So culture and language both matter, but culture shouldn't be ignored just because everyone speaks English. Another recurring recommendation is to show explicit respect to the father or father figure. Meet him first when appropriate. Consult him on decisions and approach confrontation carefully. This isn't about reinforcing sexism. It's about entering the family through a door they experience as respectful. Closely related is the idea of doing separate subsystem interviews, especially early. Parents can talk about adult matters without losing face in front of kids, and kids can talk about conflicts without publicly defying parents. It also gives you a clearer read on each person's English level and acculturation. The authors warn us not to pathologize structures that are culturally normative, like strong parent-child hierarchy or an older sibling with caregiving duties. Instead of, you shouldn't do that, start with clarifying roles and make them workable. Then give concrete, doable suggestions. Many Hispanic families in the literature were lower income and dealing with immediate stressors. Present focused, directive, structural, or cognitive behavioral tasks were a good fit. Abstract, insight only work can feel like a luxury when the family needs change now. Finally, engagement. Hispanic families in these studies responded when therapists were warm, personal, and proactive, even on the phone before session 1. Structural strategic engagement more than doubled intake attendance in Sapochnik work, and it boosted completion rates. That tells us engagement style is part of cultural competence, and the authors close with an important qualifier. These 10 guidelines are a beginning, not a rigid recipe. National origin, generation, class, and how long the family's been in the US all shift what's most useful. So we still have to assess and adapt. All right. I think our final reading for this week was Decriminalizing Immigration, Working with Undocumented and Mixed Status Families. So this article was written by two of my wonderful colleagues, Doctors Espinoza and Dadras. It's a 2018 article on decriminalizing immigration in clinical work. The article is written for marriage and family therapists, but the logic applies to anyone working with immigrant families. So we'll look at the current anti-immigration climate, how that climate affects undocumented and mixed status families, and what a social justice, non-colorblind clinical stance actually looks like. So the authors start with context. In 2015, there were about 46.6 million immigrants in the US, and roughly 11 million were undocumented. So this is not a marginal group. Public opinion has improved over time, but about a third of Americans still see immigrants as a burden. That ambivalence is made worse by media and policy narratives that label people as illegal, criminal, or culturally threatening. The article calls this an anti-immigrant, even xenophobic and Muslimophobic context, and says this context itself is a stressor for undocumented families. Next, the authors name the myths that undocumented immigrants commit more crime, bring disease, or overuse services. They point to reports showing these are myths, but they're not the stories we see most often in mainstream media. Social media becomes what they call a critical apparatus for repeating those narratives. And agencies like ICE, created to find, detain, and deport, give the myths policy muscle. The outcome is a powerful social construction. Undocumented becomes almost synonymous with criminal. A major contribution of this article is centering mixed status families, families where some members are undocumented and others are citizens or permanent residents. Between 2009 and 2013, about 5.1 million US children lived with at least one unauthorized parent, and almost 80% of those kids were US citizens. So this is not rare. Studies they cite show that even the threat of deportation harms children's psychosocial development, and it affects parents too. They can become highly anxious and overprotective. Families start living in a constant fight or flight mode, hypervigilant, feeling imprisoned, and bending daily routines to avoid any contact that could trigger detention or deportation. The authors argue that psychotherapy has often treated immigration as a political or legal issue and has under-researched the psychological cost of being undocumented. But undocumented people usually face discrimination from multiple systems: work, healthcare, policing, schools. So their distress is not just anxiety in the DSM sense, it's a rational response to criminalization. So, for MFTs, treating the individual without naming the socio-political context is an under response. Here's the heart of their practice recommendations. First, therapists need accurate, non-myth information about undocumented immigrants, and they need to be willing to advocate, not just provide treatment. Second, they call for a social justice framework. That means helping clients see that many of their problems are produced by oppressive systems, so the problem doesn't live in them. Third, they tell therapists to drop colorblind ideology. Colorblindness sounds neutral, but the research they cite shows it actually reduces empathy and makes it less likely a therapist will address racism in session. And fourth, they want ongoing self-examination, what they call examining your own political countertransference, the ways media and national rhetoric have shaped your reactions to immigration. To close, the article's main move is very simple. Being undocumented is a legal category, not a moral one. It doesn't make people criminal or undeserving, but our current climate treats it that way. And that climate harms families. Mixed status families especially need validation, safety planning, and help accessing the few services they're eligible for. Therapists can help decriminalize immigration by the words we choose, the way we locate the problem in systems rather than in families, and being willing to advocate outside of the therapy room. Okay, so for real, the last thing we had to read was that article of 19 reasons Latin America's come to the US that have nothing to do with the American dream. I hope that you found this enlightening. So this is an argument from a HuffPost article that says Latin American migration to the United States can't be explained only by people, quote, wanting a better life. The author shows that the US has repeatedly intervened in Latin America in ways that made life harder there, politically, economically, and in terms of security, and that these disruptions helped push people to migrate north. So this is a push factors the US helped create story, not just a pull to the American dream story. So the core claim is simple. Yes, people come for work and safety, but many also come because US policies made conditions in their home countries worse. The article walks through 19 examples of this. So, migration is, in part, a response to problems the US helped generate. That's why the article ends with the line that maybe the US should focus less on walls and more on being a better neighbor. The article starts historically. It reminds us that the US Mexico War ended with the US taking almost half of Mexico. Chicano advocates are right when they say the border crossed us. It also notes that the US took Puerto Rico in 1898 and intervened in Cuba multiple times. Those actions created enduring political and economic ties to the US. And later on, when conditions were bad, it was natural for people from those places to look toward the US as a place to go. Then the article shifts to the Cold War era. Over and over, the US backed coups or military regimes. Guatemala in 1954, Brazil in 1964, Chile in 1973, and it supported Argentina's dictatorship in the 1970s. Those regimes committed human rights abuses and triggered long periods of violence and economic disruption. When you have decades of instability, it's not surprising that some people eventually head north. Migration here is a delayed effect of political disruption. The article also names later U.S. involvement, funding Salvadoran forces in the 1980s, even as they committed atrocities, paying the Nicaraguan Contras, failing to control the flow of US guns into Mexico, which cartels then used, and pushing trade policies that undercut local producers. Put those together and you get more violence and fewer decent jobs, exactly the kind of conditions that push people to leave. So the takeaway is that migration from Latin America is not an isolated problem down there. It's tied to a long record of US military, political, and economic actions down there. That means border enforcement alone is a mismatch. If the US wants to reduce migration pressures, it has to stop helping create the conditions people are running from and invest in stabilizing the region.